If you're 55 and want to retire at 60, I built a sample plan for a couple in exactly that position. So in my example, we've got 1.2 million saved, and there's still about $1,000 a month short every month. So the question is, can they actually get there? Well, I'm going to walk you through the sample plan, and I'm going to show you how I would use these next 5 years to make retiring at 60 more realistic. And I'm going to give them more than one way to get there. So I'll call these folks Steve and Carol. They're both 55. Again, they've got 1.2 million saved. 1.1 million of that's in a traditional 401k. And then the other 100,000 is in a brokerage account. Their house is, let's say it's nearly paid off and that it'll be completely paid off by the time they retire. And Carol also works too, but she doesn't have access to a retirement plan of work. So I'm just going to assume that the 401k contributions here just come from Steve. And let's say that he's putting away $30,000 a year. So, and by the way, that's almost the max. Now I'm also going to assume that there's no employer matching here just to kind of keep things simpler. With a couple like this, the first thing that I look at isn't the account balance. It's what their life actually costs. So for Steve and Carol, their take home was about $9,000 a month. Now that's after taxes and retirement contributions and the other deductions that come out of their paychecks. And I'm going to assume that they're consistently moving 1,000 of that into savings. Now I bring this up because it's a pattern that I see with a lot of people, is that they count money that they're moving into savings is effort or they're spending. But it's not, right? That money doesn't count as lifestyle spending. So they're really living on approximately $8,000 a month, which is $96,000 a year in today's dollars. This is one of the simplest ways to estimate what your lifestyle actually costs. Look at what regularly reaches your bank account and then subtract what you're still saving. I mean, you'd still want to review a full year. I mean, that way you capture things like travel and home repairs and property taxes and other expenses, the things that just don't happen every month. But to keep it simpler here for Steve and Carol, I'm just going to use $8,000 a month. Now that $8,000 number, this is really where the retirement decisions begin. It's not what the $1.2 million balance. And so to build the plan, I assume some things here. First off, I assume that he was still going to be contributing $30,000 a year to the 401k until he retires at 60. I assume that they have a diversified 60-40 portfolio and that they would both begin taking Social Security at 67. Now, these are a lot of starting assumptions and not automatic recommendations at all. I mean, in a real plan, I would certainly test several different investment and claiming strategies before locking one in. But in this case, or in their case, their combined Social Security comes to about $6,100 a month at age 67, and that's in today's dollars. I also factored in healthcare separately. So we've got insurance before Medicare and then Medicare-related costs starting at 65. Now, all the numbers that I'm showing are in today's dollars. And under these assumptions, they're projected to have about $1.68 million at age 60. Now, maybe that sounds like a lot of money to you, but it's not just will they have $1.68 million. It's really, okay, after taxes and after healthcare, okay, how much can the plan provide for their lifestyle? Because they'll retire before Medicare, and health insurance is a major part of the decision. Now, depending on their income, they may very well qualify for help, with their marketplace premiums. The way it works today is that assistance is income-based, and it's a cliff system. So if you cross the limit by even $1, then you can lose that subsidy entirely. And income-based, that certainly doesn't mean net worth, and it doesn't even mean total cash flow. It's really about what shows up as reported income. Now technically, it's your MAGI, your modified adjusted gross income. So the important thing to know here is that it's important to know where that money comes from. For example, if you pull money from a brokerage account, well, typically only the gains count as income. But if you pull the same amount from a traditional 401k, well, then the whole withdrawal is going to count, right? So now we don't know if that's how it's going to work in 5 years with the subsidies, but that's how it works today. So what I did was I first modeled the more conservative version, and I assumed no assistance at all. And based on that assumption, the plan supported an initial retirement paycheck of about $6,930 a month. Now, that's after taxes and again, after accounting for healthcare expenses as well. So they currently live on $8,000 right now. And so they're about $1,070 a month short. Now that 1,070 gap, that's not set in stone. If you change the spending, the portfolio, Social Security, healthcare assumptions, any of these things, well, then the gap can change then too. And so I also modeled the version with some marketplace assistance, assuming that their income landed just a little bit under the subsidy cliff. And since, I did this because a lower income, of course, would mean even more help. And that increased the sustainable paycheck to about $7,240 a month, or roughly $310 more. It certainly helps, but it doesn't completely close the gap. And I still wouldn't build the plan around it, not 5 years out. I mean, even with it, there's still about $760 below the $8,000 lifestyle that we had assumed. Now, the conclusion here is not that they can't retire at 60. It's that they're close, but they still have some work to do. Is $8,000 what they truly need? Or is it simply what they happen to spend today? Could they comfortably live on $7,500 as an example? There's a big difference between saying, hey, we currently spend $8,000 and saying that we absolutely need and want $8,000 every month. Now, they need to know which one is true. So I'd also take a look at the difference between spending $8,000 a month today, adjusted for inflation all throughout retirement, versus starting with $8,000 a month, but then slowly scaling that back over time, which is really the concept of the retirement spending spiral. The idea that a lot of retirees do want to spend more in the healthier years of retirement, and then less later on. And so that's something else that I would compare to look at those numbers. Now, for these folks, almost all their money's in a traditional 401k. So most future withdrawals are generally going to be taxable as ordinary income. Now, they do have $100,000 in a brokerage account, but that's still a smaller part of their total. Since they're already committed to saving the full $30,000 a year into the 401k, and because they're likely in a higher tax bracket now, it probably doesn't make sense to pull back on that side. But I also wouldn't send that extra $1,000 a month into their brokerage account either. Instead, I'd prioritize Roth IRAs here first. So assuming that they qualify, their combined Roth IRA limits are up to $8,600 each in 2026. So that would provide them more than enough room for them to put that extra $1,000 a month into Roth accounts. Now, over the course of the next 5 years, that's roughly $60,000 that could be built up in Roth IRAs. And that's not counting any growth that hopefully they would have. And also keep in mind that qualified Roth withdrawals can eventually come out completely tax-free. Now that combination, the Roth money plus the existing brokerage account, that can give them some real flexibility during those bridge years. And that means that they'd actually have a meaningful tax-free bucket built up well before age 60, not just the possibility of one, later on down the road, maybe doing some conversions. Now, the goal here is to reach retirement, ideally with more than one bucket, right? Taxable, tax-deferred, and tax-free. That gives them more control of where their retirement income comes from. Now, they need coverage from age 60 to 65, and that's one of the most uncertain parts of this plan. As retirement gets closer, I would update the projected premiums and, of course, the subsidy numbers that are projected to be, right? Not just model it here at when they're 55 and assume it's going to be that way when they're 60 up till 65, right before Medicare. So here's roughly how the plan actually could play out over time. From 60 to 65, most of their spending comes from the portfolio, with the brokerage and the Roth accounts adding, some more flexibility. From 65 to 67, Medicare replaces private insurance, but the portfolio still carries most of the load since Social Security just hadn't started yet. Because of that, I wouldn't leave the whole thing in that 60-40 mix the entire time. Based on that $6,930 lifestyle paycheck, remember that doesn't include healthcare. The portfolio needs to provide about $110,000 a year in today's dollars from 60 to 65, to account for the taxes and the healthcare costs. And then that's going to come down a little bit once Medicare starts at 65. But still, we're talking roughly $770,000 total for the first 7 years. Now, remember, in my example, they're both waiting until 67 to claim Social Security. So that $770,000 has to be there to provide for the first 7 years of retirement, no matter what markets do. So over time, I'd want to position much more conservatively, shorter term, more stable types of holdings, not just more bonds in general. The rest of the portfolio, though, that has a very different job. I mean, for them, my example here, once Social Security begins, they only need about $20,600 a year from their portfolio. And because much of that remaining money won't be invested for years, it can certainly be invested for growth. So on paper, the overall mix might still look something like a 60-40, but really underneath it, it's really two pools of money. And they're doing two different jobs. And then how much really sits in each pool shifts depending upon how and when they actually end up claiming Social Security. Steve and Carol are relatively close. So in their situation, they may not need to make just one big move here to retire successfully the way that they want. I would test what happens if Carol maybe picks up some additional hours, or if maybe Steve decides to work for an additional year, and take a look at what that looks like. I would also compare Social Security claiming strategies rather than assume, again, that they just both claim at 67. For example, having the lower earner claim early while maybe having the higher earner delay, since protecting that larger benefit usually matters more for whichever one of them lives longer. Home equity and downsizing, or eventually moving maybe to a lower cost area. These are all different things that are worth considering and maybe discussing, but I treat those as backup options and not the first place that I'd look. The point here is that a few smaller changes might be enough to close the gap. Now, before I call this a realistic path, the plan also needs to show what would happen if markets don't cooperate, both before they retire as well as afterwards. I mean, right now, that $1.68 million projection at retirement, that's not locked in. I would certainly stress test the plan against different difficult periods in market history, like the dot-com crash in 2008, the 1970s, and even the Great Depression, to see how it would have held up in each one of these time periods. Now, if the balance for them does grow to $1.84 million, then their retirement paycheck for lifestyle, that goes up to $7,600 a month. But if it falls and it's, the portfolio is only $1.22 million, well, the paycheck's going to drop to $6,600. Now, notice that the paycheck doesn't move nearly as much as the balance does. And that's because Social Security eventually covers a larger share of the spending year. Now, across all of that, the plan generally called for smaller adjustments in the easier stretches and larger ones in the tough ones. Now, I think they have a realistic path to retire at 60, but not if the $8,000 monthly, lifestyle is just completely non-negotiable and if nothing else changes. At 55, I wouldn't tell them today which levers that they'll actually pull. Whether that's, some part-time income or working a little longer or spending a little bit less or a different Social Security strategy or any of these things, right? There's too much that can change in 5 years to lock all this in now. The goal at 55 isn't to predict the exact decisions that you'll make at 60. It's to make sure that once you get to be 60, that you have several good choices ahead of you instead of being forced into bad ones. So if you're 55 and you want to retire at 60, this is the real takeaways. Don't just spend the next 5 years focused on account balances. Spend them building the options that you'll actually have by the time you get there. I mean, that's how I would make retiring at 60 more realistic. Now, if you're in a similar position, retirement's getting close, you save meaningful money, but you still don't know how all the different pieces here fit together, and there's a link in the description to learn more about how I work with people. Or if you're watching on the TV, you can scan the QR code that's on the screen. I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.